made her first public speech. I'm Jane Spring, coordinator of the Maybanke Fund, which sits within the Sydney Community Foundation. My late aunt, Rosalind Maybanke Strong AM, founded the Maybanke Fund, and before she died last year, asked me to take it over. I am honoured to have this opportunity and to be part of the Sydney Community Foundation, a number of whose board members are here tonight. Tonight, we will hear from Professor Elizabeth Elliott on a very important topic. As Chair of the Disability Council in New South Wales and also Chair of the Australian Disability Strategy Advisory Council, I'm aware and very conscious that fetal alcohol syndrome contributes significantly to the needs for support of people with disabilities in our community. Over the last few years, I've sought opportunities to make a difference for people with disabilities, and I'm really pleased that I'm able to use the Maybanke Fund now to do that, because the significant work that Maybanke did was all-embracing, and it did include many aspects of the needs of women and members of the community and children, and this lecture is perfectly aligned with that. As part of my range of activities to make a difference, I'm also on the board of Royal Rehab, and I'm particularly pleased that Matt Mackay, some of the management team and board members are here tonight as well. Just a few words from me now. The Maybanke scholarships. At the moment, we have scholarships for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students studying an undergraduate degree in education at Macquarie University. I look to expand the scholarships and the work that we do over the next few years, working with the Sydney Community Foundation to make a difference in areas that would have interested Maybanke. I have a few words from one of the students. TJ Pham is a fourth-year student pursuing secondary education and languages at Macquarie University. And I'm going to quote, "My journey with the Maybanke began in my first year back in 2021, when I was given the privilege of this remarkable award. Allow me to paint a picture of the tapestry that weaves through my veins, a fusion of cultures stemming from a lineage that stretched both within and beyond the reaches of Australia. Born to a Maltese and Aboriginal mother and a Vietnamese father, I've been immersed in a symphony of languages and customs, shaping a vibrant mosaic that defines my identity. It's this rich heritage that has instilled in me a profound appreciation for diversity and a fervent desire to create inclusive spaces for the generations to come. Inspired by the guiding spirit of Maybanke Anderson, whose legacy of courage, resilience and unwavering dedication to the welfare of future generations and empowerment of women continues to illuminate my path ahead." And I think that captures what we're trying to do. I would now like to ask Yvonne Weldon AM to come and give a welcome to country. And as Yvonne comes to the stage, I'll just introduce Yvonne. She's an independent councillor for the City of Sydney, and she's the first Aboriginal councillor in the city's 180-year history. She's a proud Wiradjuri woman, and she's a lifelong activist with 30 years' experience working in key government and Aboriginal organisations driving reform in health, education and child protection. Yvonne has served until recently as Deputy Chair of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, Deputy Chair of the New South Wales Australia Day Council, and as a board member of Domestic Violence New South Wales and Redfern Jarjum College. As a strong friend of my aunt, I am absolutely thrilled that Yvonne is here with us tonight. Thanks, Yvonne.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, Minister, ladies and gentlemen, sisters and brothers, all genders and identities. As was said, my name is Yvonne Weldon. I am a Wiradjuri woman from Cowra, here in New South Wales. From the waters of the Clare, which later became known as the Lachlan, and of the Murrumbidgee Rivers. I am an authorised representative of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, who are the culture authority under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act for the land this building is standing on. I'd like to pay my respects to all elders past and present, to all First Nations, to you, and the ancestors of the lands that you've travelled from. A welcome to country is an age-old tradition. It is more than just words, it is a spiritual process. By honouring their ancestors' footsteps, we are all walking in, continuing the practice of the many generations before us to the many generations to come. And when I think about generations before us, I always go back and think about my great-grandfather. Granfie was born in 1900 and he was a child that was stolen. He was taken away and he was put out across farms, across New South Wales and Queensland as a child slave. But Granfie always knew that connection of kin, that connection of country and of the spirits and the ancestors before us. He always understood what that meant to him. But when he went back home to country and married his sweetheart and had his children, he made sure that his culture that he missed out on, that he later learnt and made sure me as his great-granddaughter understood about being respectful and honouring those that came before us, and certainly honouring the generations way before each and every one of us. And Granfie said to me, no matter where you go, it's an important part of honouring their ancestors, the spirits that have gone before us. This was their home. Just like your home, you don't invite people in, or you don't expect people to come into your home unless you do invite them. So similarly, whether it's a welcome to country or even acknowledging country, it's an important part of ensuring that the many generations before us continue with us. Our boundaries are written into our Earth's natural landscapes. The boundaries of the Eora are the Hawkes River in the north, the Nepean in the west, and the Georges River in the south. On behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, the elders and the members, I welcome everyone to the lands of the Gadigal. I acknowledge the Gadigal people whose spirits and ancestors will always remain with this land, our Mother Earth. Across this beautiful continent, my people represent hundreds of nations, tribes and clans existing here for over 65,000 years. We are the world's oldest living culture. And as we're joined here this evening, let us all remember and acknowledge the many warriors that created pathways for all of us, the ones recognised and those we've never heard of. My people always listened and learnt from each other, the environment, animals, elements, and our ancestors. We don't live in isolation of body, culture, spirit, land and water, because we are one. We all need to reflect upon the footsteps and also the footprints we are leaving to know where we're heading, shaping a society, communities, a country we can be proud of. Caring for each other is a key part of my people's traditions and our culture. We all need to respect each other and all of Mother Earth, not just today, but for always. Keep my people's practices and our cycles in balance so we all can be. And as we ponder over the important milestones and points of changes in our lives, and particularly some of the heartaches that we are dealing with in our communities and in our country, think about the difference we can make today that will become the milestones of our futures. Maybanke Anderson, we thank for her sharing and her leadership. Her giving was a part of her, handing over to others, helping us all and encouraging us to help others too. Maybanke Anderson showed us the way long before any of us even existed. Through the honour and the respect of Ros and Tony Strong and the Sydney Community Foundation, we are aware of Maybanke Anderson because of them. And it continues with Jane and the whole family. So whether you are a Maybanke Anderson or a Ros Strong, may their legacy, their belief and their offering be in us all. So let us all draw upon my people's spirits as we continue on our journey. May my people's spirits walk with you and guide you as we strive forward for us all. Again, on behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, Ninyini, Nala, Wongan, Mari, Bajari, Gadi, Nurda, welcome to Gadigal. This always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Yvonne. I would now like to invite the Honourable Kate Washington, MP, Minister for Disability Inclusion and Families and Communities, to the stage. As Chair of the Disability Council in New South Wales, I am absolutely loving working with the Minister, and I'm really honoured that she's joining us tonight to share some really important insights and also to introduce our speaker. Over to you, Minister.
Thanks, Jane, and Yvonne, thank you for such a thoughtful, caring and generous welcome to country. It's I don't want to really follow after you, but very, very hopeful that I can follow in footsteps that you and your ancestors have laid, and hope as a government that we can do the same. I too want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that past practices of government in the past of colonisation, racism and discrimination have led to some of the issues that we're going to be talking about tonight. And I want to welcome you all tonight, and I'm delighted to be joining you. I came for Jane, to be honest. I couldn't come last year, and I knew when I saw the invitation, I thought, I really want to be here, knowing that Jane is such an amazing and impressive leader. And then when I heard that Professor Elliott was speaking, I thought, I'm so here. And then Jane said, will you say a few words as well? Sure. But I was going to be here anyway. But when I was really excited when I heard Professor Elliott was going to be speaking, because her important work brought the hidden epidemic of FASD into the light, and I will share how that came into my life in a way way back when. But tonight we come together for a shared purpose and of improving lives for women and children, but it's a shared purpose across the generations of Jane's family, as the great-great-great-niece of Maybanke Anderson, as well as the niece and the founder of the Maybanke Fund, and another force of nature, Ros Strong. Just like her forebears, Jane, as I said, is she's so impressive and inspires many of us daily, but she's more than that. She's a woman of integrity and purpose. So I enjoy all the time that we get to share in our various crossovers in our role. But it's that the family's legacy of advocacy for equity, equality and social justice through Maybanke Anderson herself, but just not just the talking about it, it's the doing of it, which just is so inspiring. And as the Minister for Families and Communities and the Minister for Disability Inclusion, I really do want to reassure you that our government shares this purpose. We're committed to tackling social inequality and injustice, knowing that the solutions aren't simple or easy, and acting early to reap significant benefits for the future. We understand that the solutions to many of the difficult issues our communities facing right now lie in early education, early intervention and prevention, access to public education, access to public health services, issues that were being aired by Maybanke Anderson 133 years ago to this day. And it's somewhat frustrating, I think, for many of us in the room that those issues still need to be addressed. And it's evident by the sickening and the rising rates of domestic and family violence that we are seeing in Australia right now. But stepping back a bit, before I was elected to represent the seat of Port Stephens in the Parliament of New South Wales, that was back in 2015, and it was well before I became a minister, which was last year, I was a partner in a law firm in Newcastle, and I was specialising in health law. A case came to me when I was in that role that involved a failed procedure designed to prevent future pregnancies, where a woman hadn't realised she was pregnant because she thought she couldn't. Consequently, she continued to drink and throughout the pregnancy that she thought was impossible. When her 6th child was born, she quickly realised the child had significant delays, had health issues, and consequent behavioural issues, and causing chaos in her already busy house that she had never anticipated. We investigated what happened on the health side, but it's when I first started understanding and came across fetal alcohol spectrum disorders and the work that was being done by Professor Elliott. At the time, there was very little information available about FASD. The mum hadn't heard about it, the child wasn't diagnosed with it, and it's pretty rare and very not good practice for a lawyer to be diagnosing anyone's health issues. But so little was known at the time, and it did lead to a diagnosis eventually. But a decade on, and now as the Minister responsible for the child protection system in New South Wales, and having the legal parental responsibility for more than 12,000 vulnerable children, of the more than 14,000 vulnerable children who were in the child protection system, FASD is very much on my radar. Because there are many children living in out-of-home care who are suspected of having or have been diagnosed with FASD. They face many challenges, and each day that spans right into their adulthood. And when FASD goes unrecognised and undiagnosed, children can be left without the right support, misunderstood or blamed for the behaviours caused by their disability. Without assessments and diagnosis, children with FASD in out-of-home care are highly vulnerable to placement disruptions, being given the wrong type of supports and experiencing secondary effects such as school exclusion, mental health issues, involvement in the law and substance use themselves. So accurate and timely diagnosis is key. Diagnosis of FASD for children coming into out-of-home care is complex though, and the diagnosis is made so much more difficult for many of our children because they are also coming to that place from a place of trauma. So I'll just quickly share a little bit of Max's story. Max is a young boy in out-of-home care, was demonstrating a number of behavioural issues. He was referred by his caseworker to DC, the Department of Communities and Justice's Links Trauma Healing Service. It's a multidisciplinary team. It's got OTs, physios, psychiatrists and psychologists. Max had a pre-existing diagnosis of ADHD and complex trauma, but his previous psych supports weren't making a real difference in the way he was able to operate. It led to further investigations by Links to understand his current level of functioning, and it included a multidisciplinary assessment. The assessment enabled then a diagnosis of FASD and supports by a Links psychiatrist. It then enabled an NDIS funding package and extra support for him in his placement in foster care and his education as well, which he continues in to this day. So the New South Wales Government is deeply committed to improving lifetime trajectories of children like Max and all vulnerable children across the state. But courtesy of the work of Professor Elliott, her important work, children like Max and many others have a diagnosis, have the chance of a brighter future. So please join me in welcoming Professor Elizabeth Elliott to the stage to share her world-leading, groundbreaking research and her deep knowledge and expertise about FASD. I can't wait.
Well, thanks, Jane, for giving me the opportunity to speak tonight for the Sydney Community Foundation to commemorate your great-great-great-aunt. As an ex-University of Sydney rower and a women's college girl, like you, I've admired your career for many years, and you certainly seem to have inherited some of Maybank's passion and drive. Thank you, Yvonne, for your welcome to country. It's been a great privilege of my career to have the opportunity to work with Aboriginal people in the Fitzroy Valley of Western Australia. I acknowledge that we meet on the traditional ancestral homelands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. But to paraphrase Caroline Hartness, a Cherokee friend of mine from the US who works with children with FASD, I express my gratitude for your enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waters. I see you, I respect your right to sovereignty and self-determination, and I commit to be a better listener and to learn from the truth-telling of Indigenous voices. Thank you, Minister Washington, for your introduction. You've almost given my speech, but it's wonderful to have you here tonight. Your website says that you ran for state politics because you believe that everyone deserves a fair go. And you certainly have a track record for standing up for the most vulnerable members of our community. Many of my patients are disabled, disadvantaged, living in out-of-home care, or subject to domestic violence or neglect, so I can assure you we're singing from the same tune. And I'm so pleased that someone so committed to you, and importantly a woman, holds the two critical portfolios of communities and disability inclusion, families and communities and disability inclusion in New South Wales. Now, Jane, I think I would have liked Maybanke Selfe Wolstenholme Anderson, not least because of that wonderful name. Described as a social reformer and advocate for the rights of women and children, she was amongst other things, a journalist, a feminist, teacher, a mother, president of the Suffragette League, renowned author and public speaker, and an advocate for education, early education and family planning. By all accounts, she was a gutsy woman, prepared to stick her neck out for what mattered. She once said, and I quote, "When I stand up to speak, all the wild horse spirit surges up in me, and though I tremble, I feel as if I was ready to fight like a lioness." She was evidently also a realist, however, about the place of women in society in the 1800s, because that quote continues, "But we shall win more by being soft, so I'm going to try and be as wise as a serpent and as harmless as a dove." It is said that, above all, Maybanke strove to reduce inequality for women and children through education, women's advocacy and social reform. She left a remarkable legacy, and I wish I'd had the opportunity to meet her. Thank you all for attending tonight, family, friends and colleagues. By doing so, you are supporting her ongoing legacy through supporting her charity. I'd particularly like to welcome the Honourable Sharman Stone, AM, Professor Carol Bow, my colleague, AC, Dorothy Hodnott, AO, and Christine Brooks, who's here representing the National Organisation for Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder. I've learned through reading about Maybanke that she was also concerned about the impact of alcohol in society, particularly for women and children. In 1922, she wrote a pamphlet called Matters Relating to the Drink Traffic for the Women's Investigative Council of New South Wales. In it, she provided what she called, in large letters, facts, not theories or opinions, and made a direct link, and I quote, between alcohol excess, crime, poverty, destitute children, and the human and economic losses to the community. She reported that 29 of 36 female inmates of the Sydney Female Refuge and 130 of the 135 in the Long Bay State Reformatory were there for drunkenness. Many, however, she said, were fine, well-educated women, and they often expressed their wish that the repeated temptation of the open bar did not exist. After one visit to the Sydney Central Court, she reported There was a woman who, while visibly pregnant, was 5 times confined to the cells. During the last detention, the child was born in the cell. But before the baby was 8 weeks old, the woman had been again before the court 4 times, charged with drunkenness. She noted that in the year ending April 1920, over 19,000 children in New South Wales were, and I quote, so little cared for by their parents that they needed the watchful protection of the state. Nearly 1% of our population, she said, is a pauper child. She calculated that the cost of boarding and lodging for out-of-home care for these children and the salaries for the officers who were looking after them amounted to over £250,000. In contrast, the amount spent that year on alcohol in New South Wales was over £11 million. Maybanke concluded that the question of drink is more, much more, than a consideration for the drunkard. She said, if less was spent on strong drink, we should not have to be taxed to keep this large army of destitute children. Surely, she asked, if less was spent on strong drink, the future of our young people is more worthy of should be more worthy of more consideration than the immediate gain of the publican and the brewer. She then urged the women of Australia to, and I quote, consider the future of the thousands of children who know no parent as a result of the 2 besetting sins of Australia, drunkenness and gambling, and to ponder what sort of citizens will they become? What will they do for the future of our country? Maybanke indeed used facts, not opinion, to make her point and refrained, though she was under considerable pressure, from recommending alcohol prohibition. Though Maybanke could not have known it, I propose that many of the destitute children that she described would have had fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So what is fetal alcohol spectrum disorder? What do we know about it in Australia? What are its consequences and how should we as a nation respond? Although the harms of alcohol in pregnancy have been known for centuries, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which I'll refer to as FASD, was not described in the English medical literature until as recently as 1973. It really is a wicked disorder that results from a brain injury caused by prenatal exposure to alcohol, and it's characterised by a wide range of severe impairments in learning, behaviour, communication and development. You see, when a pregnant woman drinks alcohol, it readily crosses the placenta and rapidly enters and equilibrates with the fetal bloodstream. Have you ever felt a bit woozy after having a glass of champagne? Imagine what effect that is having on a brain the size of a pea. Alcohol is a neurotoxin. It has a predilection for the brain and the nervous system. It causes brain cell death, impairs brain growth, damages brain structure, and not surprisingly, disrupts brain function. The brain continues to grow right up until the last part of pregnancy and is vulnerable throughout the pregnancy. But alcohol is also a teratogen. A teratogen is an agent that disrupts the growth and development of the fetal organs. And you'll recognise thalidomide and congenital rubella infection as other well-known teratogens. So exposure to alcohol in the first trimester of pregnancy, when all these organs are forming, may result in defects of the structures of the heart, the kidneys, the lungs, the eyes, the ears, and more. And, depending on the timing of exposure, alcohol may also result in characteristic facial features, such as those shown here. Now, I want you to just turn and have a look at your neighbour. Do they have narrow eye openings, a thin upper lip, flattening of the area between the bottom of the nose and the lower lip? Please don't worry if you have one of these features, or even 2, but if you have 3, perhaps you could come and see me later. Alcohol then is one of the most common causes of birth defects, of developmental delay and of intellectual disability. And the real tragedy about FASD for people who live with it, and for those like me who see children in our clinic each week, is that it is potentially completely preventable. But more of that later. So before I go on, I just want to quash a few myths about FASD. The first is that FASD is confined to children of alcoholic mothers. This is not true. No safe level for alcohol use in pregnancy has been established. No amount, no type, and no time is right. The second is that FASD is an Aboriginal problem. Not so. Alcohol doesn't discriminate, but may cause FASD wherever it is readily available. That's not to say that there aren't some Aboriginal communities that are at high risk of harm, places where families have endured historic trauma, live in disadvantage, and use alcohol to deal with their stress. The third myth is that FASD is a result of poverty. Absolutely not. FASD affects all stratum of society. Indeed, the highest consumers of alcohol, both before and during pregnancy, are women like you and me, educated and well off. I wonder if our children get the more palatable diagnoses, such as ADHD, rather than FASD. And it's interesting that Maybanke alluded to the fact that it was the well-off women often who were drinking. It wasn't only those who were disadvantaged. The fourth myth is that everyone with FASD has abnormal facial features, as shown in this slide. This is not true. In fact, our national data suggests that only 1 in 5 children have the 3 characteristic features that I mentioned, because, as I said earlier, this depends on exposure at a critical time in the first trimester of pregnancy, around the 3rd week of gestation. But what's interesting is that recent work we've been doing using 3D imaging in children who come from a cohort of women who had only low to moderate alcohol intake suggests that even a low amount of alcohol in the first trimester may cause subtle facial features at 1 year of age. And we've just done our study at 8 years of age and found that those features persist. So that compared to children who had no exposure, even low-level exposure may affect the brain, which controls the growth of the face and hence affect the facial features. The fifth myth is that all people with FASD have a low IQ. And again, this is not true. Individuals have a wide range of intellectual ability, and many have an IQ within the normal range. And finally, the myth that you grow out of FASD. Definitely not. I've just returned from the International Conference on FASD in Seattle, attended by over 100 adolescents and adults with FASD, and I can reassure you it has lifelong impacts. Just ask them, or their parents or caregivers. Not surprisingly, due to their brain injury, many of these young adults have poor cognitive function, challenging behaviours, and they had poor academic performance, and many dropped out or were expelled from school. Some have sexualised, impulsive or aggressive and antisocial behaviours, substance use or mental illness. Some, as we heard in our conference this week, Sharma, pose a violent threat to their own families. Most require supervised living. Many encounter the justice system, and some suicide. Many have experienced early life trauma. Indeed, the coroner in the recent inquiry into youth suicide in the Kimberley, which was often associated with FASD, attributed suicide to the crushing effects of intergenerational trauma. Excuse me. But despite their challenges, many individuals with FASD have unique talents and strengths that can flourish with early diagnosis, with appropriate treatment, and with support from family and society. So while being realistic about their challenges, clinicians always strive to take a strengths-based approach. The Changemakers is a group of young adults who are advocates for FASD, and this includes Jessica Birch from Australia, who's shown here at the conference in Seattle. In Seattle, they presented new evidence collected from over 400 individuals with FASD on the high rates of medical illnesses, renal, respiratory, cardiovascular, immunological, that plague adults with FASD. And although some of these outcomes are likely a direct effect of alcohol on the developing organs, others are mediated through epigenetic effects. So, to divert for a moment, epigenetics is a new science that addresses the effects of environmental exposures on our DNA. In short, prenatal exposure in the intrauterine environment, whether to alcohol, other drugs, nutrition, or stress, does not alter the sequence of genes in the DNA of the unborn child, but can switch those genes on and off, akin to turning on a light switch. Activation of a gene may in turn increase the risk for later adverse outcomes and may exaggerate the outcomes that we see in FASD. For example, in an animal model, prenatal alcohol exposure confers an increased risk for hypertension in the adult. The emerging evidence about the effect of alcohol on gene function is fascinating. For example, alcohol use by parents even before conception can cause epigenetic changes in either of the parent's genetic material, the sperm or the egg, that can be passed on to the offspring. According to US author Michael Golding, it's time to debunk the assertion that it's all mum's fault. He says that until doctors start asking the father about his drinking, we will never fully know the contribution of paternal alcohol exposure to birth defects and child health. Even in the period before fertilisation and implantation of the egg into the uterine lining at the end of the second week in pregnancy, maternal alcohol can cause epigenetic changes in the fertilised egg. And finally, epigenetic changes can be passed from generation to generation. To illustrate this, let me tell you about an experiment conducted in the agouti rat. When pregnant rats who have a white coat were fed alcohol, they gave birth to babies with orange fur. When those rats became pregnant, they too gave birth to rats with orange fur, even if they were not fed alcohol. In other words, the epigenetic changes acquired following alcohol exposure in one pregnancy can be passed to subsequent generations, even in the absence of alcohol use in those pregnancies. But surely you might ask, Australian women are not still using alcohol in pregnancy. I'm afraid so. Our recent work in pregnancy cohorts in Melbourne, Sydney and Perth show that up to 60% of women drink alcohol during pregnancy. But no woman wants to harm her unborn child. And it's important not to blame or shame women who use alcohol in pregnancy, but to approach them with compassion and to try and understand why they drink and to assist them to abstain. So why do women drink in pregnancy? Well, firstly, 40% of pregnancies in Australia still, despite advances in contraception, are unplanned. So many women inadvertently expose their children to alcohol before they even know they're pregnant. And often when you speak to women, before they knew they were pregnant, they had been to their brother's wedding, their sister's 21st, etc., and had drunk substantial amounts of alcohol. Most women, of course, will give up alcohol as soon as they realise that they're pregnant. However, others don't know the risk, or they get conflicting advice from professionals and friends. And yet others have an addiction, they're alcohol dependent, and they really need specialist help to help them stop drinking without risking harm to the pregnancy or the baby. And it's really up to our primary health physicians to identify those women well before they even become pregnant. So how common is FASD in Australia? Well, we don't have good prevalence data for the general population, but using information on the proportion of pregnant women who use alcohol in Australia and data from North America, we estimate that the rate could be as high as 2 to 4 per 100 live births. To put this in perspective, this exceeds the prevalence rates for Down syndrome, spina bifida, and autism spectrum disorder. And if we use that mid-range figure of 3%, then based on the number of births in Australia in 2023, we could expect over 3,000 children to be born each year with FASD, or 8 per day, far more than we currently recognise. At 3% prevalence, the Canadians estimated that the annual cost of FASD to their country was about $6.9 billion. The annual cost. This takes into account healthcare, law enforcement, out-of-home care, special education, supportive housing, long-term care, prevention, and the indirect costs of productivity losses of individuals with FASD due to their increased morbidity and mortality. And by the way, the average age of death in adults with FASD is about 34. So surely prevention is better than a better option than spending all this money trying to mop up the effects of alcohol exposure in pregnancy. So what do we know about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder in Australia? Well, we have a mechanism called the Australian Paediatric Surveillance Unit, which allows us to collect national data each month from paediatricians on children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And I want to give you just a little snapshot of these data. Since 2015, over 1,000 children newly diagnosed with FASD have been reported. So these are new diagnoses each month, not all those other children who are already in the community. The typical child's diagnosed at about 8 years of age, by which time many have entrenched behaviours and learning difficulties and have missed opportunities for early intervention. 2/3 are boys and 19% have a sibling with FASD. And what this indicates is that we've missed opportunities for prevention in that family. Of the children, 55% identify as Indigenous. This, of course, is a very high proportion, considering that fewer than 3% of our population is Indigenous, and that Indigenous communities are poorly served by the specialist paediatricians who report to this system. Most children, indeed 75%, are known to our child protection services, and only 1 in 5 lives with a biological parent. So these are the children that we see in our clinic in Sydney. Many were removed from their family because of ongoing alcohol use in the home. There's also an overrepresentation of children from regional and remote Australia. Only 2% of our population, but 21% of the children in the national database with FASD live in a remote location. Over 80% of these children have severe problems with attention and executive functioning, the ability to plan and undertake complex tasks. And over 60% of them had problems with adaptive function, that is things like living and social skills and social communication, academic achievement, and language. Thus, in summary, most of the children reported to us are boys, Indigenous, live in out-of-home care, come from remote Australia, or have an affected sibling. Most of these children were also exposed to polysubstance use in addition to alcohol. For example, in addition to alcohol, 70% of the biological mothers of these children with FASD used cigarettes during pregnancy, and 65% used cannabis. So these rates are much higher than the use reported in the general population. Of concern, our recent analysis shows that prenatal nicotine and cannabis exposure both exaggerate the effects of alcohol. For example, children exposed to alcohol and cannabis prenatally, as opposed to alcohol alone, are 2 times more likely to have severe problems with adaptive function or motor skills or mood or sleep disorder. And this work really highlights the importance of including all drugs in public health messaging about pregnancy, indeed including everything we know that we can inform women about how to achieve a healthy pregnancy. Now, I hope I've convinced you about the impact of FASD on health and education outcomes. But when it comes to the economic burden, the Canadians showed that the largest cost component is juvenile justice. So why are FASD and juvenile justice inexorably linked? Children and youth with a brain injury are often impulsive and easily led. They fail to distinguish right from wrong. They just don't understand the consequences of their actions or learn from their mistakes, particularly if they have cognitive impairment. In court, they don't comprehend orders because of their poor language skills. Due to their poor memory, they may confabulate, provide inconsistent evidence, or plead guilty to crimes that they've not committed. Do you remember this appalling photograph of a child masked and restrained in the Dondale facility, which actually precipitated the Royal Commission into the protection and detention of children in the Northern Territory? This inquiry found that FASD is a major contributor to incarceration of children. Think also of the youth unrest prompting the recent curfews in Central Australia, where, and I quote, experts said, FASD diagnosis is a key step in tackling the Alice Springs youth crime. And think of the recent riot in the Banksia Hill Detention Centre in Perth. We know from Professor Carol Bauer's work there that 90% of the detainees have a significant brain impairment, and at least 36% of them have FASD. Most are boys, most have been in out-of-home care, and few have ever had the opportunity of a neurodevelopmental assessment. In comments following the Banksia Hill riot, Premier Mark McGowan condemned the teenagers as engaging in, I quote, a form of terrorism. When asked if he accepted that many of the children at the facility had disabilities and medical conditions such as FASD, which might impact their consequential thinking, McGowan replied that this was just an excuse. Of course, no one condones aggressive or destructive behaviour, but the riots occurred in the context of the recent conviction of one of the guards for assault of a child, the use of solitary confinement and restraint, and the inappropriate detention of children in the adjacent adult facility. Going against their own prison guidelines, many children had been locked in the cells for extended periods, for up to 24 hours a day. One boy on 26 occasions in the previous 6 months. Now, incarceration of children is unpalatable, full stop. But a child can be deemed guilty of a criminal offence and hence jailed from the age of 10 in Western Australia. Fortunately, several states of Australia have recently committed to raising the age of criminal responsibility to 14 years, consistent with recommendations from UNICEF. Currently in Australia, about 600 children aged between 10 and 16 are in justice detention every night after involvement or alleged involvement in a crime. I've seen many Aboriginal children with FASD detained for petty crime, released, re-offend, be incarcerated, and enter a lifelong involvement with the justice system, with the ultimate risk of death in custody. So how can we move forward? We need to start by acknowledging that jail is not the right place for young children with severe developmental or cognitive disability, and it's harmful to their health and mental health. We should screen all children for FASD and other impairments at the first contact with the justice system. We must help children charged of a crime to understand their court orders and the consequences of their actions, and to assist them in making their plea. We need to consider new ways to respond to child crime, such as justice reinvestment models, which shift costs and services into the community. These rehabilitation and diversionary programs are evidence-based. We know they work. They have better outcomes. They reduce crime and recidivism, and they're far cheaper than prison. For example, in 2010 to 11, it was estimated it cost $17 in the community per day, compared with $650 in juvenile detention. We simply must implement the often repeated recommendations from previous Royal Commissions and inquiries, not fund more inquiries. And we must raise the age for incarceration nationally. Finally, how as a nation can we respond to FASD? In 2004, Carol Bauer and I wrote an article asking, FASD in Australia, is it fact or fiction? At the time, there was little clinical expertise, limited awareness of alcohol harms, no funded assessment clinics, no prevalence data, and fewer than 10 publications from Australia on either FASD or alcohol in pregnancy. I'm pleased to report that over the last 20 years, Australia has made great gains in addressing FASD. This has been underpinned by strong advocacy from groups such as the National Organisation for FASD, established by Sue Myers AM, and the Foundation for Alcohol Research and Education. It has involved a collaborative national approach involving researchers and clinicians. It's involved listening to the voices of families living with FASD and support from our government. And it involved leadership by courageous Aboriginal women. With citizenship rights for Aboriginal people came simultaneous dispossession of land, unemployment, eligibility for the dole or sit-down money, and access to alcohol. So alcohol on the one hand can help drown the sorrows of historic trauma and disadvantage, and on the other threaten the survival and well-being of future generations. It is the genesis of many of the problems that we see today throughout our society, not only in Aboriginal settings. In 2008, Aboriginal elders June Oscar AO, who's our most recent Social Justice Commissioner for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and Emily Carter AM, who's now the CEO of Manawuntukura Women's Resource Centre in the remote Fitzroy Crossing of Western Australia, successfully lobbied for restrictions to access of full-strength alcohol. This circuit breaker halved alcohol-related violence overnight, allowing the community to pause. To their dismay, when they looked around, they realised that alcohol use in pregnancy had damaged their kids. In an address to Parliament that year, June Oscar said, "Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is a tragedy that somehow transcends other aspects of grief and trauma. Here is innocent young life, the future of our people and all that goes with it, our culture, our language, deep knowledge of our creation and the laws of our country, being born into this world with brains and nervous systems that are so impaired that life for that person, from birth to death, is cruelly diminished." That year, the women developed the Marulu strategy to diagnose and prevent FASD and support families of children living with FASD. Marulu is a word in the Bunuba language that means precious and refers to their children. In 2009, my colleague Professor Jane Latimer AO, who had made a film about the alcohol restrictions, and I were invited by June Oscar and Maureen Carter of the Nindalingari Cultural Health Services to partner with the Aboriginal communities on the Lililwan project to describe the prevalence of alcohol use in pregnancy and FASD. Lililwan is a Kimberley Creole word that means all the little ones or children. Acknowledging that this work was potentially stigmatising, the community contended that if there were no data, there would be no perceived problem and no need for solutions. Hence, we went to work with a team of clinicians and researchers from the University of Sydney and the George Institute for Global Health, and I acknowledge that some of the team, Drs. Barb Lucas, Tracy Sung and Philippa Dossiter, are here tonight. Working in the Fitzroy Valley was really a reality check for those of us who call Sydney and Melbourne our home. Few of you, I suspect, have visited towns like Wonkajonka, Yakanara or Nunkamba, up to 700 kilometres inland from Broome. Few will have heard the languages of the Wallamajari, Gunyandi and Bunuba people. Few could imagine that life for Australians living there could be so tough. In the 45 remote communities of the Fitzroy Valley, we found that 55% of primary school-aged children had been exposed to heavy levels of alcohol in pregnancy, and that 1 in 5 had a diagnosis of FASD, amongst the highest rates worldwide. Yet, despite these hard truths, the Lililwan project provided help and hope. It provided diagnoses for children, better healthcare and services, alternative pathways of education, parenting programs, educational interventions, a preschool and family centre, training for health professionals, support for families, awareness of alcohol harms, and most importantly, a decrease in the use of alcohol in pregnancy. June Oscar said, "We live in the best country in the world, and if we want to address our most challenging problems, we need to learn to embrace diversity and work together." In the Murruloo strategy, she said, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people achieved great things by working together, and in the process, we came to understand each other's world. She continued, "While the situation in some Aboriginal communities is distressing, I feel a great sense of optimism when I see the groundbreaking work that we initiated. Our journey has taught us that Aboriginal people must take control. We can change what is happening in our communities. So, when you read the next media piece of the suffering occurring in communities like ours, don't think of us as victims. Rather, support us to be the architects of our future, a future in which every child has the right to be born healthy and fulfil their potential." This work, I think, emphasises the critical role of women in realising change for children and families. And just look around this room and you'll see some of the women who are involved in that type of work. The Little Ones strategy caught the attention of the legal profession, and I think Anne Cregan is here, health professionals, and most importantly, politicians. And one of them was the Honourable Sharman Stone. In about 2010, I think, Sharman, you initiated Parliamentarians for the Prevention of FASD, providing regular opportunities for clinicians, researchers and advocates to visit Parliament House and meet with MPs and their staff and discuss FASD. She then initiated the House of Representatives' inquiry into FASD, which was called The Hidden Harms, and was published in 2012. What followed was bipartisan support, funding, over $120 million to date, a national FASD strategic action plan, which was the first internationally, a FASD advisory group for the Australian government, a guide to the diagnosis of FASD, national surveillance and a registry for FASD, the FASD hub or website, and the No FASD helpline and website. We now have state-based FASD assessment services. FASD is now included in the new Medicare items for paediatricians, psychiatrists and allied health professionals, and it's listed as a disability on the National Disability Insurance Scheme. We have had a national awareness campaign, Every Moment Matters, and I hope some of you have seen those ads on television. And since July 2023, pregnancy warning labels have been mandated for all alcohol products in Australia. And this came really after decades of lobbying and strong opposition from the alcohol industry. So this may all sound rosy, but we still have the dire need, particularly for increased clinical capacity. We need free and easily available services for all. We've also made progress in research. The NHMRC funded a Centre for Research Excellence in FASD, and there are now more than 300 Australian publications in the medical literature, and Australia is recognised as a leader in the field internationally. So where to from here? Well, we must address the inequity that is at the origin of FASD. All Australian kids deserve a fair go, and that means the best possible start in life. After all, child well-being is at the centre of societal health and prosperity. And alcohol, of course, is involved in causing many of the social issues we face today. Think domestic violence, mental illness, drug abuse, Aboriginal disadvantage, suicide, crime. We must address the social determinants which underpin these issues and push for a fairer society with opportunities for education, safe housing, health and employment, autonomy and self-determination for all. And we must view FASD through a human rights lens. In the context of FASD, Australia is a signatory to the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Rights for People with Disability, and the Declaration of the Rights for Indigenous People. But these conventions are somewhat toothless. While ratification of a convention is relatively easy, Few have been incorporated into Australian law and thus are neither enforceable nor find their way into policy. This was exemplified in 2010 when, in relation to the issue of children in offshore immigration detention, Prime Minister Tony Abbott said, "I'm sick of being lectured by the United Nations." Jessica Birch, the young woman with FASD that I mentioned earlier, gave a keynote address at the recent Seattle conference. Simply put, she said, "Our rights look good on paper, but without a solid framework and sufficient resources to apply them in the context of advocacy, policy reform, program development, training and services, too many individuals with FASD continue to be unable to access their most basic human rights." She was not diagnosed with FASD till the age of 33 years and lamented her inability to access early, informed healthcare, a fundamental human right. She said, "So, like most with FASD, my time in school was overwhelmingly traumatic, leaving me grappling with crippling anxiety, depression, and enduring feelings of confusion, unworthiness, and failure. I carried these feelings with great difficulty into my socially isolated and lonely adult life. The outcome of the many years required to unravel and heal from this experience remains to be seen. It's a work in progress." Now, I want you to put your hand up if you've had a drink in the last month of alcohol. Okay, well, alcohol is entrenched in our culture. Most of us drink, but we really do need to minimise its harms, particularly for those with alcohol addiction or other vulnerabilities. Above all, we must prevent FASD. So we all need to gang up against the powerful alcohol industry and advocate legislation for evidence-based solutions. We know what works: appropriate taxation and pricing, limits on advertising and promotion, stricter regulations on online purchasing, limits on the number of liquor outlets. We don't need 73 in Alice Springs, and restricted opening hours all reduce harm. And we know that this has been proven in places like Newcastle, where the opening hours were restricted by just 2 or 3 hours. It made a huge difference. But are our politicians listening? The recent community response to the Me Too movement and to the domestic violence crisis shows a groundswell of public concern for social issues in which alcohol plays a role. And as Margaret Mead said, "Never doubt that a small number of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. It's the only thing that ever has." And I'm sure Maybank would have agreed. And I just finally want to acknowledge all my patients, clinician team, and researchers and funders of our work. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Liz. That was everything I wished for and much more. I can't wait to get hold of your notes. I'd like to call on our last speaker, Lucy Brogden AM, patron and ambassador for the Sydney Women's Fund and a long-time supporter of the Sydney Community Foundation. Her advocacy work is extensive. Like my family, Lucy was inspired by Maybanke Anderson's activism, and I really look forward to her reflections tonight. She will wrap up tonight's event, after which I will make 3 key thank yous. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. And it's always a temptation in the vote of thanks to give your own lecture in response, but I'll try and resist. So as Jane said in the opening, it is 133 years ago tonight that a group of women met in Sydney to catalyse a movement for women's suffrage in New South Wales. And I think it's just so powerful to feel that energy come down through the ages. And one of the women at that meeting was Maybanke Anderson, and thanks to the great work of Jan Roberts, who's here tonight, we actually have the transcript of Maybanke's speech from that night, and that's available in Jan's book. But amongst In concluding her speech 133 years ago, Maybanke said, "By and by we shall be looked upon as pioneers, or nearly so, and our daughters and granddaughters who stand at the dawn of the 20th century, the women's century, will say, 'These women had not our education, they had few of our advantages, few of our privileges. They only tottered on the narrowest path which has merged into the broad road that we walk freely on.' But," she said, "we hope that if they remember this little band of women who stand here tonight, that they will remember that they did what they could." And it's so humble, but the power and the energy that we can feel here tonight and continue that legacy of being a cause for positive social change is really powerful. In this room are descendants of Maybanke and those that were inspired by Maybanke. Jan Roberts, who I said is here, wrote a book about Maybanke, and I was so inspired by Maybanke's life that my husband and I decided to give our daughter the middle name of Maybanke, and at 16 she is feisty and her own little force for positive change. The Maybanke Fund and the Sydney Community Foundation would like to thank you all for joining us here tonight. Minister Washington, thank you for doing the introduction. Yvonne Weldon, a great friend of the Community Foundation and a wonderful woman of Sydney, thank you for your welcome and continual reminder of the land that we stand on. And I think in the context of tonight, particularly, I'd like to acknowledge the deep, deep understanding that our First Nations people bring to social and emotional well-being. The work of Pat Dudgeon and others really shows us the connection to culture and ancestry is so powerful to well-being, and there's so much that we can learn from that. I'd like to really thank Elizabeth for giving us your time tonight, busting myths, giving us an introduction to epigenetics, linking to Maybanke. And I think one of the great opportunities I had was working with Professor Mari Bashir. Before she was Governor, we both worked in juvenile justice in New South Wales, and the tagline back then was "Juvenile Justice, Second Chance for Kids." And she'd literally grab a pen and cross out second chance and say first chance for kids, because the children coming into the juvenile justice system were malnourished, illiterate, had complex health issues, FASD, a raft of issues, and sadly for many of them, this was the first chance they had at any sense of structure of medical intervention and care, and how wrong is that that's their first chance. I was also reminded in listening to you, Elizabeth, of, I think it's Simon Chapman said this, that the paradox of prevention is when it succeeds, nothing happens. And I think too often in government we are looking for the ribbon-cutting moment when actually we want to be wiping things out really early, far upstream as we can. So thank you for sharing the knowledge, but thank you for giving us the hope and really allowing us to see the legacy of Maybanke continue. As Jane said, the Maybanke Anderson scholarships currently provide financial support to aspiring young early childhood educators so that they can learn themselves and then go back to country and continue the power of education in their communities. But Jane has grand plans for the scheme, but she'll need your support. And part of my job tonight is to ask you to really think about how you might contribute to the Maybanke Fund and the work that Ros and Tony can establish, that it can continue and really flourish. And it is important that we acknowledge Ros and Tony and really tonight feel their passing so deeply. So like her namesake, Rosalind Maybanke Strong has left a legacy, and that's a legacy in terms of a bequest for the Maybanke Fund, and that will allow the work to continue, but your support will allow it to grow. And if you are interested in a broader legacy, like Ros, one of the things we're looking at the Community Foundation is what we're trialling as the Jacaranda program. Just as jacarandas are not native to Sydney, they are Sydney. And like many of us, we're not native to Sydney, but today we are Sydney. And when that lilac wave appears across the city in late October, early November, And those that were at Sydney Uni know that it's too late to start studying when the jacarandas bloom in the quad. It is the colour of Sydney. There are urban myths about this great purple haze across Sydney. One is that midwives used to give mothers a little jacaranda sapling after their birth of their baby, and they'd take it home and plant it in the garden. And if that's true, the jacaranda is a lasting legacy, a lasting gift. The purple haze, the lilac haze, the purple rain, that annual anticipation that we all have of something beautiful to come. In all that we share, the good, the bad and the beautiful of Sydney, we are Sydney. And so I ask you to think about what you might do for the Maybanke Fund, the Women's Fund and the Sydney Community Foundation. Talk to the team that are here tonight. Keep coming to these events. Be part of that social change, that spark that was fired 133 years ago tonight. And really, let's keep Sydney growing into the beautiful place it is. Thank you all so much.
Thanks very much, Lucy. Now I have a couple of thank yous to make. Liz, you are the first. If you would mind coming up to the stage. I have some bunches of flowers under here, so I'm going to carefully pull them out and say, I'll come out. Thank you very much. So pleased. And Minister, I wanted to thank you too. It's just fabulous to hear your reflections, and your story about your legal career absolutely was unexpected.
Like
and
politics.
Oh, such a sad but amazing story. Oh, I got it wrong. And Jodie, I'm going to hand that to you. And just to say, as I come round the corner here, and there's Darryl with the camera, I just want to say that I could not have done this without the support from the team at the Sydney Community Fund. It's a stressful thing, running an annual lecture. There's a moment when you have 20 people registered and then you have 27 people registered and you start to panic. And Jodie said to me, Sydney book's late, Jane, don't worry, we'll get there. And with everyone's support, we did get there. And I am so grateful to everyone for coming tonight. I need to let you know you're on the hook. We've booked this room for the 6th next year and the following year. So I now need to find people to give Maybanke relevant lectures on an annual basis, but on a specific night. So welcome any suggestions there. But I want to thank everybody, and I do encourage you to get involved in the work of the Sydney Community Foundation. We can all make a difference, and it's fantastic making a difference with a group of committed people in the way that Maybanke did in those early days. Some of the women she worked with were absolutely extraordinary. The degree of difficulty, the lack of education, the social structures, the fact that poor Maybanke had to earn her own living and run a school, deal with all sorts of things, and the death of many children due to the diseases of the day makes her achievements all the more outstanding. But all of us, we have so many freedoms, so much education, so much opportunity and potential to make a difference. And I hope, because you are here, that you have that same commitment. And I look forward to seeing all of you next year. Thank you very much.